November 20th, 1943, 5:44 in the morning. USS Maryland, 12 miles offshore Betio Island. First Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins, 29 years old, from El Paso, Texas, stood on the deck of the battleship watching the pre-invasion bombardment. For the past hour, Maryland and her sister ships had been pounding Betio with 14-inch shells. The island, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, was erupting in continuous explosions. Fire and smoke rose hundreds of feet into the air. The concussion from the naval guns was so intense that Hawkins could feel in his chest. Around him, Marines of the 2nd Marine Division prepared to board landing craft. The mood was confident, almost casual. The bombardment was the heaviest pre-invasion barrage the Marines had ever witnessed. Surely nothing could survive that level of destruction. The Japanese defenders, estimated at perhaps 2,000 troops, must be dead, dying, or in shock. The landing would be unopposed. The Marines would simply walk ashore and count bodies. Hawkins knew better. As commander of the Scout Sniper Platoon, he'd studied intelligence reports on Betio's defenses. The Japanese had spent over a year fortifying the island. Concrete pillboxes, reinforced bunkers, coconut log barricades, steel tetrahedrons in the water, barbed wire everywhere. The defenders weren't regular infantry. They were Rikusentai, Special Naval Landing Force troops, elite Japanese Marines equivalent to American raiders. These men wouldn't surrender. They would fight from prepared positions until killed. And Betio was tiny. The island measured approximately 291 acres, smaller than New York's Central Park. But those 291 acres contained 4,500 Japanese defenders in fortifications designed to withstand naval bombardment. Betio was shaped like a bird, roughly 2 miles long and 800 yards wide at its widest point. The entire island was flat, barely rising above sea level, constructed of coral. There was no high ground, no cover, nowhere to hide. At 0610 hours, the naval bombardment lifted. Carrier aircraft swept in, bombing and strafing. The island disappeared under explosions and smoke. At 0830 hours, the first wave of Marines began climbing into landing craft. Hawkins and his Scout Sniper Platoon would go in with the assault waves, tasked with clearing the long pier that extended 500 yards from shore into the lagoon. At 0905 hours, the landing craft and amphibious tractors, Amtracs or LVTs, began the run to shore. The Amtracs could cross the coral reef that ringed the island. The conventional landing craft, Higgins boats, would have to stop at the reef if the tide wasn't high enough to allow them to pass over. Intelligence reported the tide should be adequate. The boat should make it across. At 0910 hours, reality hit. The tide was lower than predicted. The Higgins boats grounded on the reef, 500 yards from shore. Marines poured out into chest-deep water and began wading toward the beach. Behind them, more boats arrived and grounded. Thousands of Marines, laden with equipment and ammunition, began the 500-yard wade through the lagoon, and the Japanese opened fire. Machine guns positioned in concrete pillboxes swept the lagoon with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery shells burst among the waiting Marines. Mortars dropped into the packed men. The water churned with impacts. Marines fell, wounded or killed, disappearing beneath the surface. Hawkins watched from his Amtrac, one of the few vehicles that could cross the reef. The scene was beyond nightmare. Hundreds of Marines struggling through chest-deep water, burdened with 70-pound packs, rifles held above heads. No cover, nowhere to hide, machine guns firing from prepared positions. Men were dying by the dozens, then scores, falling into water that began turning red. This wasn't the unopposed landing the confident predictions had promised. This was slaughter. This was Tarawa. And the battle had just begun. This is the story of the Battle of Tarawa, of the 76 hours that produced over 3,000 American casualties on 291 acres of coral. Of the first opposed amphibious landing against fortified positions in the Pacific War, of the Marines who waited 500 yards under fire with nowhere to hide, of Lieutenant William Hawkins who charged down a 500-yard pier and earned the Medal of Honor, of Colonel David Shoup who established command while wounded and sent the message, "Issue in doubt," and of the lessons, purchased with blood that changed every subsequent amphibious operation for the rest of the war. Tarawa Atoll and the Gilbert Islands represented a stepping stone in the American advance across the Central Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz's island-hopping strategy required seizing bases that could support further operations toward Japan. The Gilbert Islands, specifically Tarawa and Macon Atolls, were selected as the first objectives in this Central Pacific drive. Tarawa Atoll consisted of numerous small islands surrounding a large lagoon. The most important island was Betio, where the Japanese had constructed an airfield. Capturing Betio would provide the Americans with an air base for operations against the Marshall Islands, the next target in the island-hopping campaign. The strategic importance was clear, but the tactical challenge was unprecedented. Previous amphibious landings in the Pacific, Guadalcanal, New Georgia, others, had achieved surprise or faced limited opposition. Tarawa would be different. The Japanese had fortified Betio extensively. The island's commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had boasted that 1,000,000 men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years. The Marines had 18,000 men and planned to take it in 3 days. The plan called for the 2nd Marine Division, commanded by Major General Julian Smith, to assault Betio on November 20th. The division would land on the northern shore, 3 beaches designated Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3. Naval and air bombardment would soften defenses. The assault waves would land at 0830 hours. By nightfall, the Marines should hold the airfield. By the 3rd day, the island should be secure. But the plan had critical flaws that wouldn't be fully understood until Marines were dying in the lagoon. The tide predictions were wrong. The water over the reef was too shallow for landing craft. The bombardment, while impressive, wasn't long enough to destroy reinforced concrete bunkers. The intelligence underestimated both the number of defenders and the strength of fortifications. And most critically, no one had anticipated what it would mean for Marines to wade 500 yards through chest-deep water under fire from prepared positions. The Japanese forces defending Betio represented some of the best troops in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, Rikusentai, were elite amphibious assault troops, roughly equivalent to U.S. Marines. These weren't conscripts or garrison troops. They were volunteers, highly trained, ideologically committed to fighting to the death. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded the defense. Shibasaki was an experienced officer who'd served in China. He understood that Betio couldn't be held indefinitely against American material superiority, but he intended to make the Americans pay maximum price for every yard of coral. Shibasaki had spent over a year fortifying Betio. The defenses were sophisticated and redundant. Approximately 500 concrete and steel pillboxes covered every approach. These weren't simple bunkers. They were reinforced concrete structures with walls up to 5 feet thick, roofs covered with steel and coconut logs, designed to withstand naval bombardment and aerial bombs. The pillboxes were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Machine guns could sweep every inch of beach and reef. Artillery pieces could engage landing craft. The positions were mutually supporting. Even if some were destroyed, others could cover the same sectors. The reef itself was an obstacle. Steel tetrahedrons, anti-boat obstacles, had been placed in the water. Barbed wire was strung underwater, and on the beaches, mines were buried. A coconut log seawall, 3 to 4 feet high, ran the length of the beaches, providing both obstacle and fighting position. The garrison totaled approximately 4,500 men, more than double what American intelligence estimated. These included 2,600 Rikusentai, 1,000 construction workers from Korean labor battalions, and 900 additional support personnel. The combat effective force was approximately 2,600 elite troops in prepared positions with orders to fight to the death. Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized destroying enemy forces at the water's edge. No retreat, no defense in depth. The defenders would fight from the beach fortifications and counterattack at night. Every man understood the mission. Inflict maximum casualties on the Americans, delay the advance, make them pay. Shibasaki was confident. His fortifications had been tested against simulated American bombardment levels. The bunkers could survive. The troops were fanatical. The Americans would come ashore and die on the beaches. Even if Betio eventually fell, the cost would be so high that the Americans might reconsider their offensive strategy. The pre-invasion bombardment of Betio began at 0445 hours on November 20th. Battleships Maryland, Colorado, and Tennessee, supported by cruisers and destroyers, opened fire from ranges of 10,000 to 15,000 yards. The sound was tremendous. Multiple 14-inch and 16-inch guns firing simultaneously created rolling thunder that could be heard for miles. The shells, each weighing over a ton, struck Betio with devastating effect. Explosions walked across the island. Palm trees disintegrated. Buildings collapsed. Fire spread. To the Marines watching from the transports, it appeared that nothing could survive. One Marine later recalled thinking, "This is going to be easy. There won't be anyone left alive." The bombardment continued for over 2 hours, pausing only to allow carrier aircraft to make bombing and strafing runs. The planes delivered 500-pound bombs and napalm. Machine gun fire from the fighters swept the beaches. By 0830 hours, when the bombardment finally lifted to allow the landing craft to approach, Betio was obscured by smoke and dust. But the bombardment, while spectacular, was inadequate. 2 hours of naval gunfire wasn't enough to destroy concrete pillboxes with 5-foot walls. Many shells hit coral or sand, creating impressive explosions but causing limited damage to fortifications. The reinforced bunkers, designed specifically to survive bombardment, did exactly that. Moreover, the bombardment killed relatively few defenders. The Japanese troops were inside the bunkers, protected by concrete and steel. Some were killed by direct hits or by concussion. Some were temporarily stunned. But most survived, shaken but combat effective, waiting for the Americans to come ashore. The confidence among the Marines was understandable but misplaced. They'd never seen bombardment on this scale. The visual effect, explosion, smoke, fire, suggested total destruction. The psychological impact of watching such overwhelming firepower led Marines to believe resistance would be minimal. This expectation made the reality they encountered even more shocking. At 0830 hours, the first wave of Marines began the approach to Betio. The assault force consisted of 3 battalion landing teams attacking Red Beach 1, Red Beach 2, and Red Beach 3 simultaneously. Each wave included both Amtracs, which could cross the reef, and Higgins boats, which couldn't if the tide was too low. The Amtracs went first. These were LVT-1 and LVT-2 alligators, tracked amphibious vehicles that could carry approximately 20 Marines each. They were lightly armored, slow, and mechanically unreliable, but they could cross coral reefs. The Marines had approximately 75 Amtracs available, barely enough for the first waves. At 0910 hours, the first Amtracs reached the reef. The vehicle struggled over the coral, tracks churning, engines straining. Japanese fire was light initially. The defenders were still recovering from bombardment, unsure what was happening. The first Amtracs crossed the reef and approached the shore. Then the Japanese opened fire in earnest. Machine guns and the pillboxes, having survived the bombardment, swept the water with interlocking fire. Artillery pieces, positioned to engage landing craft, fired into the approaching Amtracs. Several Amtracs were hit and destroyed. Others made it to shore, but were immediately engaged at close range. Behind the Amtracs, the Higgins boats carrying the bulk of the assault force approached the reef. These were wooden-hulled landing craft designed for beach landings. They drew approximately 3 feet of water. Intelligence had predicted the tide would be high enough, approximately 5 feet over the reef, to allow the Higgins boats to cross. The predictions were wrong. At 0920 hours, the Higgins boats began grounding on the reef 500 yards from shore. The coxswains, trained to beach their craft and lower the ramps, found themselves stuck on coral with the beach impossibly distant. Marines poured out of the boats into water that should have been waist-deep, but was instead chest-deep, sometimes neck-deep for shorter men. The scene became chaos immediately. Hundreds of Marines, burdened with 70-pound packs, rifles, ammunition, radios, flamethrowers, struggled through the water. The bottom was uneven coral, treacherous footing. Men stumbled and fell. Equipment was dropped. The formation dissolved into scattered individuals, all wading desperately towards shore 500 yards away. And the Japanese machine gunners, positioned in pillboxes with clear fields of fire, opened fire systematically. The Marines in the water had no cover. They couldn't dig in. They couldn't take cover behind terrain. They couldn't return effective fire, while wading chest-deep, holding rifles above their heads. They could only keep moving towards shore and hope they weren't hit. Men began falling. Some were hit by machine gun fire and dropped beneath the surface. Others were wounded and struggled to stay afloat. The water began turning pink, then red. Bodies floated. Equipment drifted. The 500-yard wade became a gauntlet of fire that seemed to take hours, but lasted perhaps 20 minutes for the survivors. Not all Marines were forced to wade. Those in the Amtracs reached shore, though many were hit and destroyed. But the majority, thousands of Marines in the follow-on waves, had to wade that terrible 500 yards. The casualty rate was catastrophic. Entire platoons were decimated before reaching shore. Some companies lost 50% of their men in the wade. The survivors who finally reached the beach were exhausted, scattered, disorganized, and in shock. Red Beach 1, on the western end of the landing area, became the scene of the worst carnage. The 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines attacked this beach, landing directly in front of some of the strongest Japanese fortifications. The battalion commander, Major John Scuttle, was in a Higgins boat that grounded on the reef. Scuttle attempted to coordinate the landing, but quickly lost communication with his companies. Radio equipment was soaked or destroyed. The scattered Marines waiting towards shore couldn't report their status. Scuttle, watching from the reef as his battalion was destroyed, made the agonizing decision to send a message to the division, receiving heavy fire. Issue in doubt. On the beach, the Marines who survived the wave found themselves pinned down against a coconut log seawall. The seawall, 3 to 4 feet high, provided some cover but also created killing zone. Japanese defenders could fire down on Marines huddled against the wall. Attempt to climb over the wall drew immediate fire. The casualties piled up. Marines who reached the seawall collapsed in exhaustion, only to discover they were in killing zone. Wounded men called for corpsmen. The corpsmen tried to reach casualties, were shot. Dead Marines lay in the water at the reef's edge, in the shallows, stacked against the seawall. Attempts to organize attacks failed. Officers trying to rally men were targeted by Japanese snipers. Small groups attempting to advance over the seawall were cut down by machine guns. The Marines had flamethrowers, demolition charges, and grenades, but using them required exposing themselves to fire. Some Marines found gaps in defenses, spots where coconut log seawall was damaged or where Japanese fields of fire didn't overlap perfectly. These gaps became focus points for infiltration. Individual Marines or small groups would work their way through, getting behind pillboxes, attacking with grenades and flamethrowers. This close-quarters fighting was vicious and deadly, but was the only way to reduce the fortifications. By midday, Red Beach 1 was seen of horror. Bodies floated in the lagoon. The beach was covered with dead and wounded. The survivors were pinned down, exhausted, running low on ammunition. Some units had suffered 70% casualties. The battalion was combat ineffective. The landing on Red Beach 1 had failed. Extending from a beach 500 yards into the lagoon was a long wooden pier, constructed by the Japanese to allow ships to dock despite the reef. This pier became both tactical objective and symbol of Marine determination. Lieutenant William Hawkins and his scout sniper platoon were tasked with clearing the pier. This was suicide mission. The pier was completely exposed. No cover, wooden planks elevated above the water, machine guns firing from both ends. Anyone attempting to advance down the pier would be silhouetted against sky and water. Perfect target. Hawkins understood the mission's difficulty, but didn't hesitate. At approximately 0930 hours, his Amtrac reached the pier. Hawkins and his Marines climbed onto the wooden structure and began advancing. Japanese defenders at the far end opened fire immediately. Machine gun rounds tore through the wooden planks. Marines fell. Hawkins kept moving. He used his rifle and grenades to suppress defensive positions. When Marines behind him were hit, he personally dragged wounded men to cover. When pillboxes blocked advance, he attacked them with grenades and demolition charges. His example inspired the platoon to keep moving despite casualties. The advance down the pier took hours. Every yard was contested. Japanese snipers targeted Marines from positions on shore. Machine guns fired from the pier's end. Mortars dropped around the advancing Marines. But Hawkins refused to stop. He personally destroyed multiple defensive positions, killed numerous defenders, and led from the front throughout the action. By afternoon, Hawkins' platoon had cleared most of the pier, though Japanese still held positions at the far end and on nearby Burnsville Wharf. The cost was severe. The platoon suffered heavy casualties. But the pier was now available for supplies and reinforcements to be brought directly from ships to shore, bypassing the deadly reef crossing. Hawkins continued fighting throughout November 20th and into November 21st. He was wounded multiple times but refused evacuation. On November 21st, while clearing Japanese positions near the pier, Hawkins was hit by machine gun fire and mortally wounded. He died shortly after, having fought for over 30 hours straight. Hawkins was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation recognized his extraordinary courage in leading the pier assault, his refusal to accept medical evacuation despite wounds, and his leadership that inspired his platoon and contributed directly to the battle's success. The pier assault became one of the iconic moments of Tarawa. Marines advancing across completely exposed structure under fire, refusing to retreat, taking casualties but completing the mission. Colonel David Monroe Shoup commanded the 2nd Marines, the regiment responsible for the assault. Shoup was in a later wave, scheduled to land after the initial assault waves had secured the beaches. When his landing craft grounded on the reef, Shoup faced the same terrible weight as thousands of other Marines. Shoup waded ashore under fire, was hit by shrapnel in the leg, but continued to the beach. Arriving at approximately 1,100 hours, Shoup found chaos. The assault had stalled. Units were scattered. Communications were disrupted. Casualties were catastrophic. Many officers were dead or wounded. The chain of command was breaking down. Shoup established his command post against the coconut log seawall on Red Beach 2. Despite his wound, which he refused to have treated, Shoup began organizing the defense and coordinating attacks. He personally directed fire on Japanese positions. He organized ammunition distribution. He established communications with offshore ships. He consolidated scattered units. At approximately 1,230 hours, Shoup sent a message to division headquarters that became famous. Issue in doubt. This three-word message conveyed the desperate situation without exaggeration. The landing had not failed. Marines held foothold on the beaches. But success was not assured. The outcome hung in balance. The issue in doubt message had significant impact. It informed General Julian Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division from offshore, that reinforcements were urgently needed. It conveyed that the optimistic predictions had been wrong, and that Tarawa would be far costlier than anticipated. It was honest assessment from ground commander who understood the gravity of the situation. Shoup's leadership during the critical first day was decisive. By maintaining command presence at the front, by refusing to be evacuated despite wounds, by personally coordinating actions across the confused battlefield, Shoup provided the steady leadership that prevented collapse. Marines could see their regimental commander at the seawall, calmly directing operations under fire. This example was powerful. Throughout the day, Shoup coordinated the gradual expansion of the beachhead. Small gains were made. A pillbox destroyed here, a gap in the seawall exploited there. By nightfall, Marines held precarious positions on all three beaches, though penetration was measured in tens of yards rather than the hundreds anticipated. Shoup established a defensive perimeter and prepared for the expected Japanese counterattack at night. He positioned machine guns, organized fields of fire, ensured ammunition distribution. When Japanese attacked after dark, they were repulsed by coordinated Marine defensive fire. The perimeter held. Shoup would remain in command throughout the battle, continuing to direct operations despite his wound, refusing evacuation until Betio was secured. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership. The citation emphasized his courage under fire, his refusal to accept medical treatment while Marines were still fighting, and his tactical skill in organizing victory from initial chaos. The 500-yard wade through the lagoon became a defining experience for Marines at Tarawa. Thousands of men made this crossing, and for those who survived, the memory never faded. Private First Class Robert Sherrod, a war correspondent with Time magazine, made the wade with the Marines. His account, published after the battle, brought the horror of Tarawa to American public. Sherrod described wading in chest-deep water, hearing machine gun rounds hitting the water around him, seeing Marines fall and disappear. He described the exhaustion, the fear, the helplessness of being unable to fight back or take cover. Many Marines remembered specific moments, seeing the man next to them hit and fall, struggling to keep rifle above water while wading through coral, losing equipment and having to continue without it, reaching the beach after what seemed like hours only to discover they were still under fire and the real fighting hadn't begun. Some Marines didn't make it, weighed down by equipment, hit by fire, they disappeared beneath the surface. Some were wounded in the water and drowned despite attempts to reach them. The lagoon became graveyard. Bodies floated, equipment drifted, the water turned red for hundreds of yards. The Amtrak crews made multiple trips, shuttling Marines from reef to shore. These crews suffered heavy casualties. Amtracs were lightly armored and vulnerable to Japanese fire. Many Amtracs were destroyed. Crews were killed or wounded but continued operating damaged vehicles. Some Amtracs made 5 or 6 trips, each time crossing killing zone under fire. The Marines who reached shore were changed. The wade had been traumatic in ways that couldn't be adequately described. Men who'd trained for amphibious assault had never imagined anything like this. The concept of wading 500 yards chest-deep under fire from prepared positions simply didn't exist in training manuals. It was unprecedented, and the Marines who survived carried psychological scars for life. Before we continue with the night counterattacks that tested Marine defensive positions, Why 17 Japanese prisoners from 4,500 defenders demonstrated unprecedented fanaticism, and how the lessons from Tarawa's 3,000 casualties changed every amphibious operation from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. If you're fascinated by these stories of battles where every assumption was proven wrong, of operations where Marines paid terrible price for lessons that saved lives later, of assaults where courage faced impossible odds on bloodiest ground ever fought, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We publish deeply researched military history documentaries every week that bring you the Pacific War battles that shaped amphibious doctrine, the islands where Marines fought for every yard of coral, the operations where tactical disaster forced innovation that won the war. Now back to November 20th, 1943, nightfall on Betio, and the Japanese counterattacks. Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized night counterattacks. American forces, unfamiliar with terrain, and disorganized from daytime fighting, were vulnerable after dark. Japanese troops, knowing the ground and comfortable operating at night, could infiltrate positions and attack with advantage. The first night on Betio, November 20th to 21st, the Japanese launched several counterattacks against Marine positions. These weren't coordinated mass assaults. The bombardment and daytime fighting had disrupted Japanese command structure. Instead, they were company and platoon-sized attacks at various points along the Marine perimeter. The largest attack came against a boundary between Red Beach 2 and Red Beach 3, where Marines had established tenuous connection between units. Approximately 300 Japanese troops assembled in the darkness and charged the Marine line at approximately 0200 hours. The attack was conducted with typical Japanese tactics: screaming, bayonets fixed, grenades thrown. The psychological impact was significant. Marines, exhausted from a day of combat, facing human wave attack in darkness, had to maintain discipline and fire control. Panic would mean breakthrough and disaster. But the Marines held. Machine gunners fired into the attacking mass at point-blank range. Riflemen shot targets they could barely see. Flamethrower teams engaged groups at close quarters. The defensive fire was devastating. The Japanese attack broke, leaving bodies piled in front of Marine positions. Additional smaller attacks occurred throughout the night at various points. Japanese infiltrators tried to penetrate gaps in the line. Snipers fired at muzzle flashes. Grenades were exchanged at ranges measured in yards. The fighting was vicious and personal, sometimes hand-to-hand combat with knives and entrenching tools. By dawn on November 21st, the Marine perimeter had held, but the cost was significant. The night attacks killed or wounded dozens of Marines. Ammunition was depleted and had to be resupplied. Sleep was impossible. The Marines faced another day of fighting after 24 hours of continuous combat. The Japanese losses in the night attacks were severe, perhaps 500 killed for minimal gain. But Japanese doctrine accepted such losses as necessary. The attacks disrupted Marine rest, prevented consolidation, inflicted casualties. Even failed attacks served purpose by forcing Americans to remain constantly alert. November 21st began with Marines holding precarious footholds on the beaches, but unable to expand significantly inland. The situation remained desperate. Reinforcements were needed urgently, but getting them ashore remained problematic. The Reef still blocked conventional landing craft. General Julian Smith committed his reserves, the 6th Marines, which had been held offshore. These fresh troops would land and push inland, breaking the stalemate. But they faced the same Reef problem. The landing was conducted during afternoon high tide, when water over the reef was deepest, but many Marines still had to wade. The reinforcements allowed coordinated attacks on the second day. With fresh troops, Marine commanders could organize battalion-sized assaults on Japanese strongpoints. The attacks were methodical: identify pillbox, suppress with rifle and machine gun fire, approach with flamethrowers and demolition charges, destroy position, move to next target. This was slow, costly work. Each pillbox had to be reduced individually. The Marines developed techniques. Use tanks if available to provide covering fire. Use flamethrowers to force defenders out or kill them inside bunkers. Use satchel charges or TNT to collapse bunkers. These techniques worked but required Marines to expose themselves to fire. The coordination improved as communications were restored. Artillery from ships offshore could be called in on specific targets. Aircraft could be directed against Japanese positions. The overwhelming American firepower advantage, which hadn't been decisive on the first day, began to tell as targets were identified and engaged systematically. By nightfall on November 21st, Marines had expanded the beachhead significantly. They controlled approximately one-third of Betio. The airfield was within reach. But casualties continued mounting. Companies that landed with 200 men were reduced to 100 or fewer. Some platoons had only a handful of effectives. The butcher's bill was rising inexorably. The second night saw fewer Japanese counterattacks. The defenders were depleted, disorganized, running low on ammunition. The attacks that did come were smaller and were repulsed more easily. The Marines, though exhausted, were now in stronger positions with better fields of fire. November 22nd saw the Japanese defense begin to collapse. With reinforcement ashore and the beach had expanded, Marines could maneuver and coordinate attacks more effectively. The overwhelming American material advantage, more men, more ammunition, artillery support, air support, tanks, began crushing Japanese resistance. The airfield was captured on November 22nd. This was significant psychological victory. The objective that justified the entire operation was in American hands. But fighting continued across the island. Japanese defenders fought from each position until killed. Surrender was not option. The Marines cleared the island systematically, moving from west to east. Pillboxes that held up attacks for hours were bypassed and reduced from behind. Japanese troops cut off from command decided to die, fighting rather than surrender. Small groups made suicidal charges against Marine positions. The end came on November 23rd. By afternoon, organized Japanese resistance had ceased. The Marines controlled Betio. But secure didn't mean safe. Japanese holdouts remained in bunkers and would continue fighting for days. Mopping up operations would continue for weeks as Marines cleared every bunker and searched every position. The cost was staggering. The 2nd Marine Division suffered 990 Marines killed and 2,296 wounded. Over 3,000 casualties. Navy personnel supporting the operation suffered an additional 687 killed and 602 wounded, many from underwater demolition teams and Amtrac crews. Total American casualties exceeded 3,700. Japanese casualties were even more complete. Of approximately 4,500 defenders, 4,690 were killed. Only 17 Japanese combatants surrendered. Most of them were Korean laborers rather than Rikusentai. The Special Naval Landing Force troops fought to the last man. The 99.6% death rate among combat troops was unprecedented and demonstrated the fanaticism American forces would face throughout the Pacific War. The casualty figures from Tarawa shocked the American public. Over 1,000 Marines dead in 76 hours on an island smaller than Central Park. The casualty rate, approximately 17% of the assault force, was highest of any American amphibious operation to that date. The causes of casualties varied. Many Marines died in the wade, shot while crossing the 500 yards of open water. Others died on the beaches, pinned against the seawall, unable to advance or retreat. Many died in close combat, assaulting pillboxes with flamethrowers and demolition charges. Some died in night attacks. Some died from wounds hours or days after being hit, because medical evacuation was difficult under fire. The wounded presented enormous challenges. Medical personnel couldn't easily reach casualties during the first day. Men who were wounded in the wade either made it to shore or drowned. On the beaches, corpsmen worked under fire to treat wounded. Evacuation required carrying men back across the reef to waiting boats, a dangerous process that exposed both casualties and stretcher bearers to fire. Many wounded died from shock, blood loss, or exposure before they could be evacuated. The tropical heat, dehydration, and stress compounded injuries. Some wounded spent hours in the sun waiting for evacuation. Medical supplies ran low. Morphine, bandages, plasma, all were depleted faster than anticipated. The psychological casualties couldn't be quantified, but were substantial. Marines who survived physically were traumatized. The experience of waiting under fire, watching friends die, fighting at close quarters against enemy who wouldn't surrender. These experiences left scars. Combat fatigue, what would later be recognized as PTSD, affected many survivors. The material losses were also significant. Approximately 75 Amtracs participated in the assault. About half were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Conventional landing craft losses were lighter because most never made it past the reef, but many were shot up. Tanks, artillery pieces, equipment. All were lost in quantities that hadn't been anticipated. But the most shocking statistic was the Japanese casualty rate. Of 4,500 defenders, fewer than 20 combatants surrendered. The rest fought to death or committed suicide. This 99.6% death rate demonstrated that Japanese troops on fortified islands would not surrender, that every island would have to be taken by killing every defender, that the Pacific War would be war of annihilation rather than maneuver. The Battle of Tarawa was extensively photographed and filmed. Combat photographers accompanied the assault waves, documenting the landing, the fighting, and the aftermath. These images had profound impact when published in American newspapers and magazines. The most iconic photographs showed Marines crouched against the seawall on Red Beach, taking cover while under fire. The image captured the vulnerability of the Marines, trapped between the ocean and fortifications, nowhere to hide, pinned down. The photograph conveyed the horror of the battle in ways that words couldn't. Other photographs showed the Wade. Marines in chest-deep water, rifles held overhead, struggling toward shore, bodies floating in the lagoon, the beach littered with dead, destroyed Amtracs, the pier with Marines advancing under fire. These images brought the reality of Tarawa to American public in unprecedented fashion. The photographs generated controversy. Some argued they were too graphic, that showing American dead would damage morale. Others argue Americans needed to understand the cost of victory, that sanitizing war was dishonest. The debate continued throughout the war, but Tarawa's photographs ensured Americans understood that Pacific victory would be extraordinarily costly. Film footage was equally powerful. Newsreels shown in theaters across America included combat footage from Tarawa. Americans saw Marines waiting under fire, assaulting pillboxes, fighting in close quarters. The footage was shocking. Previous war coverage had been more distant, less visceral. Tarawa brought the reality of combat into every American theater. The impact on public opinion was mixed. Some Americans questioned whether small islands were worth such costs. Others were galvanized by the sacrifice and demanded vengeance against Japan. The debate over Pacific strategy intensified, but the images ensured Tarawa wouldn't be forgotten or minimized. The cost was too visible, too documented, too horrifying to ignore. The Battle of Tarawa forced comprehensive reevaluation of amphibious assault doctrine. The casualties, while appalling, purchased lessons that would save thousands of lives in subsequent operations. The reef problem was addressed through multiple solutions. Underwater demolition teams, UDTs, were formed to scout beaches and reefs before assaults, providing accurate intelligence on tides, depths, and obstacles. These teams would conduct reconnaissance before every subsequent landing, preventing repeat of Tarawa's tide miscalculation. The Amtrak problem was addressed through production increases and design improvements. Tarawa demonstrated that tracked amphibious vehicles were essential for crossing reefs. Production was increased dramatically. By 1944, thousands of improved LVTs were available. New designs included armored versions and versions mounting cannons, transforming Amtracs from simple transports to assault vehicles. The bombardment problem was addressed through longer, more intensive preparation fires. Tarawa's 2-hour bombardment was recognized as inadequate. Future operations would have bombardments lasting days or weeks. Naval gunfire would be supplemented by aerial bombing, including specialized attacks on fortifications. The emphasis shifted from spectacular firepower to methodical destruction. Intelligence gathering improved dramatically. Tarawa revealed that American intelligence had underestimated both fortification strength and garrison size. Future operations would include better photographic reconnaissance, agent reports, submarine observations. The intelligence failures at Tarawa ensured subsequent operations had much better information. Medical evacuation procedures were reformed. The difficulty evacuating wounded from Tarawa's beaches led to new doctrine emphasizing forward medical stations, dedicated evacuation craft, and better coordination. The improvements saved countless lives in later battles. The most fundamental lesson was psychological. Amphibious assault against fortified positions would be costly, brutal, and require determination beyond what peacetime training could instill. The Marines who fought at Tarawa developed institutional knowledge that was passed to new units. The battle became reference point in training. If you can handle Tarawa conditions, you can handle anything. The strategic debate about Tarawa began immediately after battle and continued for decades. Was capturing Betio worth over 3,000 casualties? Could the island have been bypassed? Should different tactics have been used? Proponents argued Tarawa was strategically necessary. The Gilbert Islands had to be taken to support operations against the Marshals. Betio's airfield was valuable for supporting subsequent operations. Most importantly, the lessons learned at Tarawa saved lives at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and other islands. The casualties were tragic but necessary to learn how to conduct opposed amphibious assaults. Critics argued Tarawa could have been bypassed. The island was small. Garrison could have been isolated and left to wither. American submarines and aircraft could have neutralized Betio without ground assault. The casualties were unnecessary, result of poor planning and inadequate preparation. The debate extended to tactical decisions. Should the assault have been postponed when tide miscalculations became apparent? Should different beaches have been attacked? Should bombardment have been longer? These questions suggested that even if Tarawa had to be taken, it could have been done with fewer casualties. Admiral Nimitz defended the operation. In a statement after the battle, he noted that Tarawa provided lessons essential for future operations. He acknowledged the heavy casualties, but argued they purchased knowledge that would save thousands of lives later. This argument became official position. Tarawa was tragic, but necessary. The families of Marines killed at Tarawa often questioned his reasoning. Letters to newspapers and Congress asked why their sons died for a tiny island that Americans had never heard of before the battle. The questions were heartbreaking and legitimate. No strategic rationale could truly compensate for personal loss. Historians examining the battle with decades of hindsight tend to support Nimitz's view. The lessons from Tarawa, UDT teams, Amtrac importance, bombardment requirements, intelligence needs, were directly applied at subsequent islands. Iwo Jima and Okinawa were extraordinarily costly, but casualties would have been higher without Tarawa's lessons. The 3,000 casualties at Tarawa arguably prevented 10,000 or more casualties at later battles, but the counterfactual remains unknowable. Perhaps a different strategic approach, bypassing fortified islands, attacking less defended targets, would have achieved victory with lower overall costs. The debate cannot be resolved definitively, which ensures Tarawa remains controversial. The Marines who survived Tarawa carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Many were wounded, burns from flamethrowers, shrapnel from artillery, bullet wounds, concussions from explosions. Some wounds healed. Others left permanent disabilities. The psychological wounds were universal among survivors. Every Marine who fought at Tarawa experienced trauma that would today be recognized as PTSD. The weight under fire, the close quarters combat, the sight of friends dying, the smell of death in tropical heat. These experiences couldn't be forgotten or processed easily. Many survivors had nightmares for decades. They dreamed of wading through the lagoon with bullets, hitting the water around them. They dreamed of being pinned against a seawall with nowhere to hide. They dreamed of faces, Marines they'd known who died on Betio. The dreams faded for some, but never entirely disappeared. Survivor guilt was pervasive. Why did I survive when better men died? This question haunted veterans. Some felt they should have done more, fought harder, somehow prevented friends' deaths. Rationally, they understood that survival in combat was partly luck. Emotionally, the guilt remained. Many survivors never spoke about Tarawa. Families knew their father or grandfather had fought there, but knew few details. The veterans couldn't articulate what they'd experienced, or didn't want to burden families with horror. The silence was protective but isolating. Only other Tarawa veterans could understand. Some survivors attended reunions of the 2nd Marine Division. These gatherings provided opportunity to connect with men who shared the experience. Stories could be told that families wouldn't understand. Bonds formed in combat were renewed. For many veterans, these reunions were therapeutic. Confirmation that they weren't alone in their memories and trauma. The Marine Corps recognized Tarawa survivors as elite brotherhood. Marines who fought there earned respect throughout the Corps. Tarawa became symbol of Marine determination and courage. Later generations of Marines were taught about Tarawa as example of what Marines could endure and accomplish. From Japanese perspective, Tarawa was both tactical success and strategic failure. The garrison inflicted casualties far exceeding typical exchange ratios. The fanatical defense demonstrated Japanese determination and fighting spirit. But ultimately Betio fell, and the defenders were annihilated. Admiral Shibasaki died during the battle, probably on November 20th or 21. His body was never positively identified among the thousands of dead. His boast that million men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years proved hollow. 18,000 Marines took it in 76 hours. But his defense made Americans pay a terrible price. The Rikusentai who defended Betio fought according to Japanese military code. Surrender was dishonorable. Fighting to death was expected. The 99.6% death rate reflected both ideological commitment and military discipline. These weren't conscripts looking for opportunities to surrender. They were elite troops who chose death over capture. The few prisoners taken were mostly Korean laborers who'd been conscripted for construction work. Even among these non-combatants, surrender was rare. Most fought or committed suicide rather than be captured. This demonstrated that Japanese forces across all categories have been indoctrinated to resist to the end. Japanese propaganda used Tarawa as example of heroic resistance. The garrison's annihilation was presented as glorious sacrifice. Other garrisons were told to emulate Tarawa's example. The message to Japanese forces throughout the Pacific was clear. Fight to the last man, inflict maximum casualties, make Americans pay for every inch of ground. This doctrine had strategic implications. If every island would be defended like Tarawa, American casualties would mount into hundreds of thousands. The island hopping strategy would become unsustainable. Japanese high command hoped that mounting casualties would force Americans to negotiate rather than continue paying the price for unconditional surrender. But Tarawa also demonstrated flaws in Japanese defensive doctrine. By concentrating forces at the beach and refusing to retreat, defenders made themselves vulnerable to systematic reduction. Defense in depth might have been more effective. Counterattacks in daytime rather than predictable night attacks might have been more successful. Japanese rigidity became liability. Tarawa can be compared to other battles to understand its unique horror. The comparison reveals why Tarawa remains synonymous with amphibious assault's terrible cost. By casualty density, casualties per square yard, Tarawa was bloodiest ground in American military history. The 291 acres produced over 3,000 American casualties. This equates to more than 10 casualties per acre. No other battle approaches this density. Even Iwo Jima, with far higher total casualties, was fought over larger area. Tarawa's tiny size concentrated the violence in ways unprecedented. The casualty rate, 17% of assault force killed or wounded, was extraordinarily high. By comparison, Normandy landings had overall casualty rate under 5%. Okinawa, fought over 82 days, had casualty rate of approximately 35%. Tarawa achieved half that rate in just 76 hours. The wade through the lagoon was unique. No other amphibious assault required troops to wade 500 yards under fire. Later operations, informed by Tarawa, used UDD teams and Amtracs to avoid this scenario. The wade remained a singular event in military history. Thousands of men advancing through chest-deep water with no cover under fire from prepared positions. The Japanese casualty rate, 99.6% killed versus captured, was extreme even by Pacific War standards. Iwo Jima saw approximately 98% of defenders killed. Okinawa had higher Japanese surrender rate due to Okinawan civilians. Saipan had mass suicides but also more prisoners. Tarawa's near total annihilation of the garrison was unprecedented. The battle's brevity made it unique. Most Pacific Island battles lasted weeks. Tarawa was secured in 76 hours. This compression of violence into such short time frame made Tarawa particularly brutal. There was no pause, no respite. Marines fought continuously from landing through final clearance. Tarawa is commemorated through multiple memorials and ceremonies. The battleground remains sacred to Marines and to Americans generally. Betio Island today is inhabited by Aikiribati people. The island shows few signs of battle. Tropical vegetation has reclaimed most areas, but remnants remain. Rusted Japanese pillboxes dot the landscape. Ammunition and equipment are occasionally discovered. The island's history as battleground is remembered. The Betio War Memorial, constructed near Red Beach, commemorates both American and Japanese dead. The memorial includes plaques listing units that fought and acknowledging sacrifice of all who died. Annual ceremonies bring together veterans, families, and officials to honor those who fought. In the United States, the 2nd Marine Division maintains Tarawa's memory as foundational to division's identity. Division reunions include Tarawa remembrance ceremonies. The battle is taught to new Marines as example of courage and determination. Individual memorials exist across America. Towns that lost Marines at Tarawa erected monuments. Schools were named for Tarawa veterans. The battle entered American consciousness as symbol of Pacific War's cost. Robert Sherrod's book, Tarawa, the story of the battle, brought the battle to a wider audience. Published shortly after the battle, the book's vivid descriptions shocked readers, but ensured Tarawa wouldn't be forgotten. Later books, documentaries, and films have continued telling Tarawa's story. The Medal of Honor recipients, Hawkins, Shoup, and others, are remembered as exemplars of courage. Their citations are read at Marine ceremonies. Their examples are taught to new generations. The medals represent not just individual actions, but collective sacrifice of all who fought. The Battle of Tarawa's legacy extends far beyond the 76 hours of fighting. The battle fundamentally changed how amphibious assaults were conducted and became symbol of Marine Corps determination. Every amphibious operation after Tarawa applied lessons learned. UDD teams scouted beaches. Amtracs were produced in quantity. Bombardments lasted days rather than hours. Intelligence was gathered more thoroughly. Medical evacuation was better organized. The improvements were a direct result of Tarawa's painful lessons. Iwo Jima in February 1945 showed how lessons were applied. The island was bombarded for over 70 days before assault. UDD teams scouted beaches extensively. Over 400 Amtracs participated. Intelligence identified fortifications accurately. The assault still cost nearly 7,000 Marines killed, but without Tarawa's lessons, casualties would have been far higher. Okinawa in April-June 1945 similarly benefited. The operation included massive preliminary bombardment, extensive reconnaissance, overwhelming numbers of Amtracs, and improved tactics. Over 12,000 Americans were killed, but the improvements from Tarawa prevented even worse losses. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Japan, could be launched. But planning for Olympic assumed casualties based on Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa experiences. Estimates range from 100,000 to 1 million American casualties. These projections influenced the decision to use atomic weapons. Tarawa thus indirectly influenced war's end. The battle demonstrated that invading Japanese home islands would be extraordinarily costly. This reality shaped strategic decisions about how to force Japan's surrender. Whether this justifies Tarawa's casualties is a philosophical question without definitive answer. The Marine Corps adopted Tarawa as a defining moment. The battle demonstrated that Marines would accomplish assigned missions regardless of cost. The determination shown waiting 500 yards under fire, fighting from the seawall, clearing pillboxes at close range. This became standard that later Marines were expected to meet. U.S. Marines never expected 4,500 Japanese on Tiny Island because intelligence drastically underestimated garrison size and fortification strength. The pre-invasion briefing suggested 2,000 defenders in modest fortifications. Reality was 4,500 elite troops in concrete bunkers designed to withstand naval bombardment. The result was 3,000 American casualties in 76 hours on 291 acres, bloodiest ground per square foot in American military history. The way to the lagoon, the fighting from the seawall, the close quarters combat clearing pillboxes, all produced casualties at rate that shocked even combat veterans. The Japanese casualty rate, 99.6% killed versus captured, demonstrated unprecedented fanaticism. Of 4,500 defenders, only 17 combatants surrendered. The rest fought to death or committed suicide. This rate warned Americans that subsequent islands would require killing every defender, that Japanese wouldn't surrender. That Pacific War would be war of annihilation. The lessons purchased with blood changed everything. UDD teams, Amtracs, longer bombardments, better intelligence, all were direct responses to Tarawa's failures. These improvements saved thousands of lives at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and would have saved tens of thousands if invasion of Japan had been necessary. From November 20th to 23rd, 1943, from the Reef to the beaches to the Airfield, from confident predictions to desperate reality to hard-won victory, Tarawa demonstrated that courage and determination could overcome nearly impossible odds but at terrible cost. 500 yards waiting under fire, 76 hours continuous combat, 3,000 casualties, 291 acres of coral, 17 Japanese prisoners from 4,500 defenders. The battle where Marines learned amphibious assault wasn't glorious, but was necessary. The island where tactical assumptions were destroyed by reality. The 76 hours that purchased lessons in blood. The bloodiest 291 acres ever fought. The Battle of Tarawa, where Marines never expected what awaited them. Where 4,500 Japanese defenders made Americans pay a terrible price. Where courage under impossible conditions earned victory that questioned whether any island was worth such cost.